To make this mini hand plane, I'm using some walnut and maple scraps that I had lying around. Now my first step here is to plane these down to a 1/4 inch, but a good alternative here is to use 1/4 inch plywood. Now I'm going to use walnut for the base and maple for the sides, and I'm fitting this tiny hand plane blade, which I'll have a link for in the description. My first step is ripping out some walnut to the blade width plus a 1/2 inch. The 1/2 inch is 2 times that 1/4 inch thickness of the sides. And now I have 2 base plates here, one front plate at 1.5 inches, and then a rear plate at 2 inches. These are going to make up the entire base, and I'm cutting it into 2 different pieces so that there's a gap in the middle where I can fit the blade, which is easier than trying to cut this in later. For the sides, I'm first ripping the maple to the same width as I did for the base, and then I'm cutting out 2 pieces at 4 inches. For aesthetics, I also chopped off the corners on the front of each one of these sides, and later on I also chopped off the end. I couldn't do that on the miter saw because of the large angle. But speaking of aesthetics, in the end I thought it would have been nice if these sides were shorter. I think it would have cleared more room to make it easier to tighten or loosen the knob for the blade. Now I need a ramp for the blade to sit on that it can be tightened against, and it's a very shallow angle. So I'm using the same 1/4 inch walnut and ripping a piece to the blade width. After the glue dried, it was time to add the angle, and because this is such an extreme angle, I'm using a trick here. I'm first adding some painter's tape just to the back of this, and then I'm going to use some 2P10 super glue in order to attach this to a sacrificial board, which I can use to hold it in place to cut the angle on the miter saw. Now this did work pretty well for me. I think it goes without saying that, this is not a permanent hold, so you do have to be careful. Go slow and just make sure it's actually cured and has a strong hold so it's not going to fly off while you're cutting it. Next I need a clamping plate, which is another piece of 1/4 inch walnut cut to the width of the blade, and this is going to hold down the blade in place by pivoting on this nail here that I'm using as an axle. So my first step here is to take the sides and drill some pivot points through. Now I realized these were actually too high, so later on I fixed that. Here's where I realized I needed a lower pivot point because of how high this piece was flipping up. It wouldn't work with the adjustment knob that I got. And rather than creating new pieces for the sides, I decided to keep these with both holes in place. I figured, I don't know, if I replace the clamping plate, maybe I come up with a new design. It couldn't hurt to have other pivot points. In case you're wondering, the type of knob I'm using is a socket cap screw, which is 1/4 like the rest of my hardware. You can adjust it with your finger, but also use an Allen wrench to tighten it more. I thought it couldn't hurt to knock down the angle a bit on the front plate just to make sure it's out of the way of the blade, so I just used this thin belt sander for that. Here I'm using some black 2P10 CA glue to fill in these holes, kind of like what you would do with black epoxy. I thought this would look cool, but in the end I think it would have looked better without it. After that, I finished the whole thing with some oil-based polyurethane. Finally, the whole thing can be assembled, starting with the nail here as the axle. It sticks out a little bit, as you see here, so I'm just going to trim that with some bolt cutters. After that, I can carefully fit the clamping plate in, which can be tricky to get it to line up with the nail. And then I can add the adjustment knob here and carefully fit the blade in, making sure my fingers are out of the way. Now I left the nail head on for easy removal, but you can remove that if you want for appearance.